Hey there, how there, ho there, it's Jeff Cutter Diamond, welcoming you to yet another Cutter Top 10 sports video. And today we're going to be looking at something Canadian, not the NHL, but the CFL and my team, the Montreal Alouettes. And I know you're going to be asking yourself why a guy from Southern Ontario is a Alouettes fan and not an Argos fan or even a Cat fan. Well, simple. I had a thing for the Argos in the Doug Flutie era, but once Doug Flutie left for the NFL, I was upset. So much so I decided to switch teams without thinking, and I switched to Montreal, who are basically always bridesmaids, kind of like my way of thinking. So anyway, we're going to be looking at the top 10 NFL, my ass, the top 10 CFL Cinderellas of all time. These are teams that broke conventional ground on everything. So let's get to it. Number 10 is the 1999 Hamilton Ticats. The Ticats are a very solid team and all that. Unfortunately, the Ticats have not won a Grey Cup since 1999, the longest streak of any team in the CFL. But yeah, Hamilton, the last time they won the Grey Cup, Ron Lancaster was the head coach, Paulo Spaldson was the kicker, and Ivor Stadium had those weird advertisement things before it got demolished to be called Tim Hortons Field, whatever it is now. But nevertheless, the 99 Ticats shocked everyone. They actually had to go beat Montreal in a tight Eastern final, and then they took on the Calgary Stampeders. Calgary won on a last-second field goal the previous year. Hamilton got the revenge on Calgary and became the champs. Unfortunately, 4 years later, they would be one of the worst teams in CFL history, being 1-17. So that does not look good for their old book. Number 9 is the 2017 Toronto Argonauts. The Argos will make a few appearances on this, but the 2017 team was dramatic. They were good. They won the Eastern playoffs, I think, from Hamilton. I can't remember, but yeah. Toronto would take on Calgary, who were looking to win their first Grey Cup in a while. They lost the previous year's Grey Cup, and yes, that will be mentioned in one of the top 10 Cinderellas. But Calgary looked pretty good. They were the class of the league. Bo Levi Mitchell was helping them. And, well, the game was in Ottawa, which is fine. But Toronto somehow won 27-24 in snowy Ottawa. Thanks to the scoop and score by Kaiser for 107 yards. Or no, 117 yards, which was one of the longest. 107 yards, which was one of the longest plays in Grey Cup history, much less CFL history. Because the Stamps runner should have just went down, and then he would have killed some time. But yeah, Toronto won the Grey Cup in 2017. Guy's pissing me off in the process. Number 8 is another Argos team, the 2004 one. The 2004 one is more of a Cinderella because of who they played. The Argos won the East, and then they had to take on BC. BC had a great quarterback named Casey Printers, who was the CFL's MVP. And BC looked pretty good. They were juggernauts and all that. The game was played in Ottawa, just like 2017. The Argos didn't know that they had a chance. And then came the puzzling decision by BC to not use Casey Printers to start, but Dave Dickinson, thinking that they went with the veteran. Unfortunately, it bit them in the ass as Toronto shocked BC to win the Grey Cup. So that was a fantastic time and all that. Number 7 is the 2022 Toronto Argonauts. This is not an Argonauts list. But anyway, 2022 was big. The 22 Argos were looking sharp. They took on Montreal, beat Montreal in the Eastern final, like almost always, Toronto, Montreal. And then Toronto would take on Winnipeg, East versus West. Winnipeg had a chance to be 3-time champs, which would have been the first time since the 1970s/80s Edmonton Eskimos. And yes, I can say Eskimos because that's what their name was. Anyway, the 2022 squad was a pretty solid squad. And then Winnipeg, it was one of the best ever, as Toronto had momentum after blocking a game-winning field goal in the final moments. Winnipeg had the win in their hands to go 3-time defending champs, but no, they fell to Toronto, and it was just brutal. Number 6 is the 1994 BC Lions. The BC Lions in '94 were a decent team. They had 2 good quarterbacks. They had Ken Austin and Denny McManus, who went on to do better things. Well, Ken Austin will always be a Saskatchewan icon because of what he did in 1989, and we'll talk about that later. And Denny McManus was not yet the superstar quarterback he was for Hamilton. But yeah, BC had things. Ken Austin was struggling, so McManus came in for him in the final. The BC Lions had to beat Calgary in the Western Final on a last-second touchdown by Darren Flutie, who was, Doug Flutie's brother, who played for BC. He ruined his brother's chances. So anyhow, the Lions would take on the Baltimore Stallions, who came out of the East and were the champs. This was the first. This was the second of 3 years that the CFL decided to do their stupid U.S. program, and Baltimore looked pretty good. A lot of the Baltimore players would go on 2 years later to be part of the Montreal team when Baltimore moved to Montreal due to the fact that the Ravens were coming to the NFL and Baltimore had an NFL team for the first time in 12 years. Stupidly, as a 9-year-old, I picked Baltimore to beat BC because I thought it would be nice to see an American team win. Well, of course, I was 9 years old and didn't do the Canadian pride as I used to do, as I usually do. But yeah, the BC Lions were hard pressed. They were hosting the Grey Cup, and they would have Crazy George, the cheerleader, helping me out. Baltimore had a few touchdowns on defense, including one which Alvin Walton got the pitch from Carl Anthony to score the touchdown. And then Louis Pasaglia, with no time left, last kick of the game in regulation, kicked one through the uprights. And Gus Johnson, who was doing game for ESPN2, said the BC Lions are Grey Cup champions. It was huge. Baltimore would strike back and win the 95 Grey Cup from Calgary. And then the CFL decided to stop going to the United States once Baltimore put the pressure on the NFL team. So that meant that Baltimore had to find a place. And thankfully, Montreal, after losing the team in 1987, had Stade Olympique ready for CFL, and they had a team. And so many of the Stallions would play for Montreal. And that was one of the best moments of NFL CFL. Oopsie. Number 5 is the 2023 Montreal Alouettes. Yeah, you think it's biased, but it's actually not. There's no other Montreal Alouette team that was a Cinderella. In fact, the top 4 are 4 different franchises, but not Montreal. The top Montreal team is number 5. The 2023 Alouettes were a modern Cinderella. Montreal got into the playoffs. I think they took down Ottawa, and then they took on Toronto. This was not a normal Toronto Argonauts team. This was a 16-2 Toronto Argonauts team because the CFL plays 18 games. That tied the record set by the 1989 Edmonton Eskimos for most wins in a season by a CFL team. And Toronto had their defense. However, Montreal's defense held up and they shocked Toronto, putting up many defensive plays and all that. I know my buddy Bill was pissed off when the Alouettes took down Toronto, and I was stunned too. And I'm like, 16-2, phooey. You knew that Toronto was great for the picking. So, and then of course it proved that, like this, the CFL, like the Big Four sports like baseball, basketball, football, and hockey, had their best team with regular season wins not win a title. Baseball, it was the 2001 Mariners, 116 wins, but not even a World Series appearance. They lost to the Yankees in the ALCS. Basketball, the 73 win Golden State Warriors choked Game 7 to Cleveland in 2016. Football, the Patriots 16-0 botched it in the Super Bowl in 2008 against the Giants. And hockey, the 65 win Bruins lost in the first round to the Panthers. So that was it. And Montreal beat Winnipeg in the Grey Cup. So that was actually the icing on the cake. Although the Argos got the Alouettes back in 2024 winning with their defense in Montreal. So they got revenge on us. Fuck. Number 4 is the 2001 Calgary Stampeders. The Calgary Stampeders are a decent franchise and all that. But the 2001 team was not the league's glamour pick, but they peaked. They did quite well. They went to the Grey Cup in Montreal, taking on Winnipeg, who had Milt Stegall, Kahari Jones, and a great offense. Unfortunately, though, for Winnipeg, they lost to Calgary 27-19, including Bob Cameron having his first blocked punt of the year, and it turned out to be a touchdown for Calgary. Calgary put up a 27-19 win. They shocked everyone. They were playoff tested, and I was upset over losing the Grey Cup pick. Number 3 is the 2000 BC Lions. The 2000 Lions are a bigger Cinderella, mostly due to the fact they were 8-10. They were below 500 and thankfully took third place in the West, and they were able to play. So they took on the best in the West and took down, I think, Calgary, and then took on Montreal in the Grey Cup. This was the first time Montreal made the Grey Cup in, I like to say, 21 years. I think 1979 was the last time Montreal went to the Grey Cup as a franchise before 2000. And then, Montreal were heavily favored. Not Anthony Cofila. Tracy Ham, Mike Pringle, and Ben Cahoon looked pretty good. The Lions survived Montreal 28-26 thanks to Louis Pasegua's couple of touchdowns and field goals, and Montreal missing the 2-point convert to tie the game. They found enough offense, versatility, timing to finish on top, and Louis Pasegua could finish on top of the world and retire. Number 2 is the 1989 Saskatchewan Roughriders. The Roughriders were bound for being a Cinderella. They had to start the playoffs on the road in Winnipeg, and they beat Winnipeg. So Saskatchewan took on the best in the West, the 16-2 1989 Edmonton Eskimos with Tracy Ham and a few other keynotes, 2 years removed from winning the Grey Cup. But somehow, in some ways, Saskatchewan on the road went into Commonwealth, beat Edmonton, and then went to the final against Hamilton. Hamilton had a little bit of an advantage because the Grey Cup was held in Toronto, of course, at the new Sky Dome, and it looked pretty impressive. But Saskatchewan and Hamilton really went to town. It was one of the greatest Grey Cups of all time, the highest scoring Grey Cup in history, 43-40. Hamilton was down by 7, and then Tony Champion made that twisting catch in the corner of the end zone to tie the game. Unfortunately, Saskatchewan had time, and Dave Ridgway kicked the field goal with 3 seconds left. And Saskatchewan won 43-40. Saskatchewan had not won the Grey Cup since 1966, and they were happy. The one bad part about it was that because Saskatchewan had to go on the road, they had to use a lot of resources, and they actually lost money winning the Grey Cup. But come on, was it worth it? It was. And finally, numero uno is the 2016 Ottawa Redblacks. Ottawa went through it. They won the Grey Cup in 1976, Tony Gabriel's famous catch with not much time against Saskatchewan, Ted Provo. But Ottawa slipped away. 1981, they shocked the world by being 5-13 and getting to the Grey Cup against the powerful Edmonton Eskimos. And they were actually up on Edmonton 20 points to 1, but ended up losing 26-23. Then Ottawa had ownership problems. They brought in the first female general manager in history, but she couldn't do much. And by 1992, they were really in trouble. Horn Chen, a Chicago restaurateur, took care of the Rough Riders, and then Ottawa folded after the 96 season. One of the longest CFL teams by tenure was actually no more. It was just like shocking. Ottawa had to sit out from the CFL for many years. And then in 2002, they got another chance being the Ottawa Renegades. So football was back in Ottawa, and then by 2007, they faltered. And then 3 years later in 2010, Ottawa got another team, the Red Blacks. And the fans came out in spades this time. Ottawa somehow got to the Eastern playoff. I think this was the year Greg Allenson had that 80-yard touchdown run, catch and run. So the Red Blacks were young. They had to take on Calgary, who were looking to win the Grey Cup. And Calgary had to kick a field goal in regulation to force overtime. It was big. John Cornish had the ball, but a swipe tackle by the Ottawa defender actually brought him down short. Otherwise, that would have been the game-winning touchdown. Ottawa went first in overtime. Henry Burris threw a pass, I think, to Ellingson for a touchdown. Someone over the middle for a touchdown. And then they missed the extra point. No, they had to go for 2 in overtime and missed. So Calgary just needed a touchdown. Didn't happen. No, it didn't. And so that's the greatest CFL Cinderella, Ottawa, because not only was that 2016 team very much underrated, and people didn't think they were going to be the first team in 4 decades to win a Grey Cup for the city of Ottawa, but the fact that Ottawa had to go through so much. Yes, Montreal went through a lot too, but Montreal had Grey Cups in spades in the 2000s, a couple in the 2000s. Ottawa didn't, so that sucked. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Diamond to do.